There was a moment, brief and unremarkable to anyone who wasn't paying attention, when the orca stopped swimming. She simply stopped. Her massive body, black and white like a living piano key suspended in turquoise water, hung motionless near the glass. And on the other side, a little girl pressed her palm flat against the cold surface, fingers spread wide, as if she could somehow reach through. The whale did not move away. She stayed. She watched. And in that silence, something passed between them that neither would ever be able to name. Something too large for language, too old for understanding. The girl's mother pulled her away seconds later, laughing nervously, saying something about lunch. But the child looked back, and the whale was still there, still watching, still waiting for something that would never come. Before this story continues, subscribe to the channel and like this video. You won't understand why until the very end. The year was 1985. The marine park had opened its gates at 9 in the morning, just as it did every day, just as it had done for over a decade. The sun rose pale and golden over the parking lot, casting long shadows between the rows of station wagons and sedans that had already begun to fill the spaces nearest the entrance. Families emerged from their vehicles carrying callers and cameras, children bouncing with impatience, parents consulting maps printed on the back of brochures that promised wonder, promised magic, promised a once-in-a-lifetime experience with creatures of the deep. The air smelled of popcorn and chlorine and the faint, salty undertone of something ancient and displaced. Seagulls circled overhead, crying out in their harsh, hungry voices, waiting for dropped food, waiting for opportunity. The gates swung open, and the crowd surged forward, a river of humanity flowing toward the exhibits, toward the shows, toward the glass walls that separated their world from another. The orca had been awake for hours. She always was. Sleep, for her kind, was never the deep and dreamless thing that humans knew. It was a half-sleep, a drifting consciousness that kept one eye open, one half of the brain alert, always aware of the walls around her, always aware of the ceiling above the water, always aware that there was nowhere to go. Her tank was 60 feet long and 30 feet deep, dimensions that the brochures described as spacious, as carefully designed for her comfort. But she had been born in a place without walls, in waters that stretched beyond the curve of the earth, in currents that carried the songs of her family across hundreds of miles. She had been 3 years old when the nets came, when the boats surrounded her pod, when the screaming began. She remembered the screaming, not her own, but the others, her mother, her siblings, the sounds they made as the nets tightened, as the small ones were lifted away, as the world she had known collapsed into chaos and salt and the deafening roar of engines. She was 32 now. She had lived in this tank for 29 years, and every morning, she woke to the same pale light filtering through the water, the same concrete walls, the same gentle hum of the filtration system that was the only constant sound in her world. The first visitors of the day pressed their faces against the underwater viewing window at 9:15. A young couple, early 20s, holding hands, their breath fogging the glass as they peered into the blue. They were looking for her, scanning the water for movement, for shadow, for the massive shape they had seen in photographs and posters and television commercials. The tank appeared empty at first, just endless turquoise stretching toward the fog wall, sunlight rippling on the surface above like a ceiling made of liquid gold. Then she emerged from the shadows at the far end, gliding forward with a slowness that seemed almost deliberate, almost theatrical. Her dorsal fin broke the visual plane first, the tall black triangle that had collapsed years ago and now lay folded against her back like a flag that had surrendered. Then her head, that smooth black and white head with its distinctive eye patch, the white marking that made it look as though she was always watching, always seeing, always knowing. The young woman gasped. The young man squeezed her hand tighter. They stood frozen as the orca approached the glass, as she slowed, as she turned her body just slightly to bring one eye directly in line with theirs. She was looking at them, not past them, not through them, at them. And in that look was something they had not expected, something the brochures had not prepared them for, something that made the young woman's eyes fill with sudden, inexplicable tears. The morning passed slowly. More visitors came, wave after wave of them, families and school groups and elderly couples and teenagers on dates. They gathered at the glass and watched her swim her circuits, the same path she swam every day, the same pattern she had worn into her muscles and her mind over decades of repetition. Left wall to right wall, surface to floor, around and around and around. Some of the visitors tapped on the glass despite the signs asking them not to. Some took photographs with flashes despite the warnings that it might disturb her. Some pressed their children up against the window and pointed and said things like, "Look how big she is. Look at those teeth. Isn't she beautiful? Isn't she amazing? Aren't we lucky to see her so close?" The orca heard none of this, or if she did, she gave no sign. Sound traveled differently underwater, became muffled and strange, and the tapping and the voices and the camera clicks blended into a constant, low-frequency drone that had become as familiar to her as the hum of the filtration system. She had stopped reacting to it years ago. She had stopped reacting to most things. At 11 o'clock, the first show of the day began in the stadium above her holding tank. The crowd filled the bleachers. 3,000 seats arranged in a semicircle around a larger performance pool connected to her tank by an underwater gate. When the gate opened, she swam through, emerging into the bright sunlight and the roar of applause that greeted her appearance. The trainers stood on platforms at the edge of the pool, buckets of fish at their feet, whistles around their necks. They raised their arms and the crowd cheered. They blew their whistles and she performed, rising from the water to touch targets, spinning in circles, opening her mouth to display her teeth, splashing the front rows with carefully calculated walls of water that made the children shriek with delight. She knew every cue, every signal, every expectation. She had learned them all in her first years here, back when learning meant survival, back when performing meant eating, back when the only choice was compliance or hunger. Now, the behaviors were automatic, encoded in her body like the patterns of her swimming, like the rhythm of her breathing, like the grief that never quite went away. There was a moment in the middle of the second show, around 2 in the afternoon, when something different happened. The crowd had thinned slightly, the midday heat driving some families toward the shaded food courts and gift shops. The stands were perhaps 2/3 full, still enough people to generate applause, still enough to justify the performance. The trainer, a young man named Daniel who had worked at the park for 3 years, blew his whistle for the high jump, the signature behavior that ended the first segment of the show. The orca was supposed to dive deep, build speed, and launch herself from the water to touch a ball suspended 20 feet above the surface. She had done it thousands of times. She knew exactly how much force to generate, exactly what angle to take, exactly how to twist her body to reach the target. But today, for reasons that no one would ever understand, she didn't jump. She dove, yes. She built speed, yes. But at the last moment, instead of launching upward, she veered to the side and surfaced slowly at the far end of the pool, near the gate that led back to her holding tank. She floated there, her head above water, her eye fixed on something in the crowd. Daniel blew his whistle again. Then again. The crowd murmured, confused, waiting. Some laughed nervously, assuming this was part of the show. But Daniel's face had gone pale. He knew her patterns as well as he knew his own heartbeat. And this was not a pattern. This was something else. He reached for the bucket of fish, held up a herring, made the gesture that always brought her back. She didn't move. She continued to float, her eyes still fixed on something, someone, in the stands. Daniel followed her gaze, squinting against the sunlight, trying to see what she saw. It was a child, a little boy, maybe 5 years old, sitting in the 3rd row with an older woman who might have been his grandmother. The boy was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just a silent stream of tears rolling down his round cheeks as he stared at the orca. His grandmother was patting his back, whispering something, probably asking what was wrong. But the boy didn't answer. He just cried, and the orca just watched. The moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the orca turned, dove, and completed the jump as if nothing had happened. The crowd cheered. Daniel gave her the fish, his hands trembling slightly. The show continued, but something had shifted in the air, something subtle and impossible to name. Later, Daniel would tell his colleagues about it, and they would nod and shrug and say that the animals had their moods, their off days, just like people. But Daniel knew it was more than that. He had seen something in that exchange, something that made him lie awake at night staring at his ceiling, something that made him hand in his resignation 2 weeks later. He never worked with marine mammals again. When people asked why, he said he had found other interests. He never mentioned the boy. He never mentioned the tears. He never mentioned the way the orca had looked at that crying child as if she recognized something, as if she remembered something, as if she knew exactly what it meant to grieve and be unable to do anything about it. The afternoon wore on. The crowds thickened again as the heat began to fade, families returning from lunch, new visitors arriving for the later shows. The orca performed twice more, executed every behavior flawlessly, received her fish, and returned to her holding tank when the gate opened. She resumed her circuits, left to right, surface to floor, around and around. The underwater viewing window remained packed with spectators, their faces pressing against the glass in endless succession, a parade of eyes that never stopped, never rested, never looked away. She had grown accustomed to being watched. It was the only constant in her life beyond the walls themselves, this endless observation, this perpetual audience, these creatures who came to stare and point and marvel, and then walked away to eat hot dogs and buy souvenirs while she remained. Always remained. Forever remained. There were other animals in the park, of course. The brochures made much of the variety, the diversity, the comprehensive collection of marine life available for viewing and entertainment. In the tank adjacent to hers, separated by a thick concrete wall, lived two bottlenose dolphins named Sunny and Splash. She could hear them sometimes, their clicks and whistles penetrating the barrier, sounds that were almost familiar, almost comforting, almost like the voices she remembered from before. The dolphins were not her kind. Their language was different, their social structure simpler, their needs less complex. They performed their own shows in their own pool, leaping and spinning and balancing balls on their noses while crowds applauded and music played. They seemed, to the casual observer, content, happy even. But she knew better. She had seen them at night, when the park closed and the lights dimmed and the silence descended. She had heard them calling out in the darkness, calling for something that wasn't there, waiting for answers that never came. The sea lions lived in an open enclosure near the park entrance, basking on artificial rocks, barking at visitors who tossed them fish from designated feeding stations. They were loud, boisterous, seemingly at ease with their circumstances. But she had watched them through the underwater viewing tunnels that connected the exhibits, had seen the way they sometimes pressed against the glass just as the visitors did, staring out at the walking legs and strollers and dropped ice cream cones as if trying to understand a world that made no sense to them. The seals were quieter, sleeker, more resigned. They swam their own circuits in their own tanks, performed their own tricks for their own fish, and slept curled together on their platforms as if the warmth of another body was the only thing that made the nights bearable. She had been alone for 5 years now. Before that, there had been another orca, a male named Kasatka, who had been captured from a different part, a different ocean, a different world. They had shared her tank for 12 years, and though they could never truly communicate, though their dialects were as different as English and Mandarin, there had been a kind of companionship in his presence. A body in the water beside hers, a shadow that moved when she moved, a breath that broke the surface when hers did. They had never mated, though the trainers had hoped they would. The park wanted calves, wanted the miracle of birth, wanted the marketing potential of baby orcas born in captivity. But she had shown no interest, and neither had he. Perhaps they knew, in whatever way they could know anything, that bringing a child into this existence would be a cruelty beyond measure. Or perhaps the chemistry was simply wrong, the attraction absent, the biological imperatives overridden by despair. Either way, no calves were born. And then, one winter morning, Kasatka was found floating motionless at the surface, his great body still, his eye empty, his breathing stopped sometime in the night. The trainers had cried. Some of the visitors, informed of the loss, had sent condolences. But she had simply swum to the far end of the tank and stayed there for 3 days, refusing food, refusing to perform, refusing to do anything but float in the corner and wait for something that would never happen. The years passed. 1985 became 1986, then 1987, then decades that blurred together like water in water. The park changed around her. New exhibits opened, old ones closed. Trainers came and went, young faces replacing familiar ones. New whistles and new buckets and new hands reaching out to touch her during the shows. The crowds never stopped coming. The faces at the glass never stopped pressing, never stopped staring, never stopped asking the same silent question that she could not answer, because she did not know the question herself. Children who had watched her perform in their youth brought their own children to see her. Grandparents who had visited on their honeymoons returned with grandchildren who had never known a world without marine parks, without captive whales, without the assumption that this was simply how things were. She grew old, not visibly, not in ways that the casual observer could detect, but internally, cellularly, in the accumulating weariness that settled into her bones and her muscles and her mind. Her dorsal fin, that magnificent tower that had once cut through the waves of the open ocean, had long since collapsed, a common occurrence in captive orcas that veterinarians attributed to various causes and activists attributed to despair. Her teeth, once sharp and white, had become worn and chipped from years of grinding against the concrete walls of her tank, a behavior that had started in her first decade of captivity and had never stopped. The trainers had drilled holes in her teeth to prevent infection, had filled them with cement, had added daily teeth cleaning to her routine of performances and feeding sessions. She endured it all. She had no choice. There was a winter, somewhere in the early 1990s, when a new trainer joined the staff. Her name was Margaret, though everyone called her Maggie, and she was different from the others in ways that the orca could not articulate but could somehow sense. Maggie didn't blow her whistle with the same sharp authority. She didn't move with the same brisk efficiency. She sat by the edge of the tank for long hours when no shows were scheduled, just watching, just being present, just existing in proximity without demanding performance or response. Sometimes she talked, her voice low and gentle, her words meaningless but her tone soothing. Sometimes she sang, old folk songs that her grandmother had taught her, melodies that drifted across the water and sank into the depths like stones made of sound. The orca found herself swimming closer when Maggie was there, found herself surfacing more often near the platform where Maggie sat, found herself looking forward, if forward was something she was still capable of, to the moments when that particular human would appear at the edge of her world. One night, very late, long after the park had closed and the lights had dimmed and the security guards had made their final rounds, Maggie returned. She climbed over the barrier that separated the spectator area from the pool's edge, sat down on the wet concrete, and dangled her feet in the water. This was against every rule, every protocol, every safety regulation. An orca was a predator, capable of killing a human in seconds, and the park's insurance policies explicitly prohibited any contact outside of controlled training sessions. But Maggie didn't seem afraid. She sat there in the darkness, her feet making small ripples in the black water, and waited. The orca watched from the far end of the tank, uncertain, suspicious, conditioned by decades of routine to expect nothing unexpected. But something about this moment was different. Something about the silence, the darkness, the absence of whistles and buckets and crowds, made her curious in a way she had not been curious in years. She approached slowly, inches at a time, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Maggie didn't move, didn't reach out, didn't make any sudden gestures. She just sat there, her feet in the water, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the approaching shadow beneath the surface. When the orca was close enough to touch, she stopped. She surfaced, just her head, just enough to bring her eye above the waterline. And she looked at Maggie, and Maggie looked at her, and neither of them moved for a very long time. What passed between them in that moment was something that neither could ever describe. Maggie would later say that she felt, for the first time in her life, truly seen. Not admired, not appreciated, seen. As if the orca was looking past her face and her body and her role and her species, looking directly into whatever she was at her most fundamental level, and acknowledging her existence with a gravity that no human had ever managed. The orca would never say anything, of course, but if she could have spoken, she might have described a similar sensation. A recognition, a remembrance, a fleeting echo of something she had lost so long ago that she had forgotten she had ever possessed it. Connection, belonging. The knowledge that another living being was truly present, truly aware, truly there. Maggie came back every night for 3 weeks. She never touched the orca, never tried to feed her, never asked her to perform any behavior. She just sat at the edge of the pool and was present. And every night, the orca swam closer, stayed longer, surfaced more often. They developed a routine of their own, a secret choreography that had nothing to do with whistles and fish and crowds. It was, in its own strange way, a friendship, or something close to it. Something that neither of them had names for because neither of them had ever experienced anything quite like it before. Then Maggie was discovered. A security guard making an unscheduled round found her at the pool's edge, feet in the water, the orca floating mere feet away. There was an incident report. There were meetings. There were discussions of liability and safety and the potential for catastrophic harm. Maggie was given a choice. Follow the rules or find another job. She tried to explain what she had experienced, tried to describe the connection, tried to make them understand that this was something precious and rare and important. But they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. They saw a dangerous animal and a foolish employee, and a lawsuit waiting to happen. Maggie cleaned out her locker that same afternoon. She walked past the orca's tank one last time, pressed her palm against the glass, and whispered goodbye. The orca was at the far end of the pool, swimming her circuits left to right, surface to floor, around and around. She didn't acknowledge Maggie's presence. She didn't surface near the glass. She didn't stop. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe stopping would have been too much to bear. The years continued to pass. The park changed ownership twice. New management implemented new policies, new shows, new marketing strategies. The orca remained the star attraction, the main draw, the face on every poster and billboard and television commercial. Estimates varied, but by the late 1990s, she had been seen by more than 40 million visitors. She had performed in over 20,000 shows. She had consumed hundreds of thousands of pounds of fish. She had swum millions of miles in circles, endless circles. Circles that added up to distances that would have carried her around the world many times over if only they had been straight, if only they had led somewhere, if only they had meant anything at all. There were other orcas in other parks, scattered around the world, living similar lives in similar tanks. Sometimes the park traded animals, moved them from facility to facility like pieces in a game whose rules only humans understood. She had been moved once in the early 80s, transported in a sling suspended from a crane, lifted from the only water she knew and deposited into unfamiliar blue. The shock had nearly killed her. The stress had weakened her immune system, left her vulnerable to infections that took months to treat. After that, the park decided she was too valuable to risk moving again. She would stay here, in this tank, in this park, until she died. And everyone knew, though no one said it aloud, that she would die here. There was no other possibility. There never had been. The new millennium arrived. The world outside the park walls transformed in ways that the orca could not perceive and would not have understood, even if she could. The internet connected billions of people. Information spread at the speed of light. And slowly, gradually, perceptions began to shift. Videos emerged of captive orcas behaving strangely, aggressively, desperately. Documentaries were made. Questions were asked. The crowds that had once applauded without reservation began to murmur, began to wonder, began to feel something uncomfortable stirring in their chests when they pressed their faces against the glass. The little boy who had cried in the stands all those years ago was a grown man now, with children of his own. He never took them to marine parks. When they asked why, he said he didn't like crowds. But the real reason was something he couldn't articulate. A memory of a whale's eye meeting his across a pool of turquoise water. A feeling that had never quite gone away. The orca was 48 years old when the announcement came. The park would no longer breed orcas. The current generation would be the last. No more captures. No more carves. No more decades of confinement for creatures who had done nothing to deserve it. The news was celebrated as a victory by some, mourned as a loss by others, and received with indifference by those who had never thought much about it either way. But in the tank, in the water, in the endless circling that continued regardless of announcements or anniversaries or changing times, nothing changed at all. She woke each morning to the same pale light, swam the same patterns, performed the same shows, received the same fish, slept the same half-sleep with one eye always open. The walls remained, the ceiling remained, the glass remained, with its endless parade of faces pressing close, staring in, asking their silent questions. She was 53 when her body began to fail. It started with her appetite. The first fish refused in decades. Then her swimming slowed, her circuits becoming smaller, less complete, as if she was forgetting the path she had worn into her muscles over so many years. The veterinarians ran tests, drew blood, examined samples, consulted specialists around the world. The diagnosis was unclear. Perhaps it was her heart. Perhaps it was her kidneys. Perhaps it was simply age, the accumulated weight of years pressing down on organs that had never been designed for this kind of existence. They treated what they could, adjusted her diet, reduced her performances, gave her medications mixed into her fish. She ate some of them. She refused others. The crowd still came, though they were smaller now, fewer families, more activists with signs that she couldn't read and slogans that she couldn't understand. On her last morning, she woke before dawn. The light had not yet begun to filter through the water, and the tank was dark, darker than usual. Or perhaps that was only how it seemed through eyes that were growing dim. She swam to the underwater viewing window and floated there, her body almost touching the glass, her eye level with the empty benches on the other side. No one was there, no faces pressed against the glass, No hands reached out. No children pointed and laughed and asked their parents what kind of fish that was. Just emptiness, just silence, just the glass separating her world from a world she had never been allowed to enter. She stayed there for a long time. The light slowly brightened. The first sounds of the waking park reached her ears, muffled and distant. The gates opening, the vendors setting up, the early visitors beginning their pilgrimage toward wonder and magic and once-in-a-lifetime experiences. She didn't move. She just floated there, watching the empty benches, waiting for something that she had given up waiting for decades ago, but somehow still expected, still hoped for, still believed in despite everything. The first visitors of the day arrived at the viewing window at 9:15. A family, parents and 2 children. The children pressing their faces against the glass, with the eager impatience of youth. They were looking for her, scanning the water, waiting for the show to begin. And there she was, floating right in front of them, so close that they could see every detail of her skin, every scar, every worn tooth, every collapsed inch of her dorsal fin. The children gasped, the parents smiled. Someone took a photograph. Someone said something about how big she was, how beautiful, how lucky they were to see her so close. And the orca watched them through the glass, watched them with an eye that had seen 40 million faces and remembered none of them, watched them with a stillness that might have been peace or might have been exhaustion or might have been something else entirely, that none of them would ever understand. She died that afternoon, between the second and third shows, while floating at the surface of her holding tank. The trainers noticed that she wasn't responding to their whistles, wasn't moving toward the gate, wasn't doing anything at all. They sent a diver in to check on her. The diver surfaced moments later, pale and shaking, and said 2 words that the trainers had been dreading for years. She's gone. The park closed early that day, the first unscheduled closure in its history. The crowds were ushered out with apologetic explanations about technical difficulties. The gift shops locked their doors. The vendors packed up their carts. And in the tank, in the water, in the silence that descended like a blanket over everything, she floated motionless, her great body finally still, her eye finally closed, her circuits finally, mercifully, complete. The news spread quickly. By evening, crowds had gathered outside the park gates, some to mourn, some to protest, some simply to be present at the end of an era. Candles were lit, songs were sung, signs were held, some celebrating her life, some condemning her captivity, some simply bearing her name in letters tall enough to be seen from the highway. She had been famous in her way. More famous than most humans would ever be. Her face had appeared on magazines and television screens and billboards across the country. Her story had been told and retold, simplified and sensationalized, used to sell tickets and merchandise and dreams of connection with the natural world. But she was gone now, and all that remained was the tank, empty and still, the water slowly cooling, the filters still humming their endless mechanical song. They held a memorial service 3 days later. Trainers spoke about her intelligence, her responsiveness, her remarkable career. Executives spoke about her contribution to education and conservation and public awareness. Someone read a poem about the ocean. Someone played a recording of wild orca calls, and the silence that followed was deeper than any silence the park had ever known. Then they drained the tank, scrubbed the walls, and began the process of deciding what would come next. There were discussions about filling it in, turning it into a garden, a memorial, a place where visitors could reflect on the creatures who had once lived here. There were discussions about renovating it, upgrading it, using it to house different species in the future. In the end, they simply covered it with a tarp and left it, an empty blue wound in the middle of the park, a reminder of something that had been here once and would never be here again. Years passed. The park changed. New attractions opened. New animals arrived. New generations of visitors walked through the gates with no memory of the orca who had once been the star of everything. The older employees sometimes spoke of her in hushed tones, shared stories of her performances, her quirks, her mysterious moods. The younger employees nodded politely and changed the subject. The world moved on, as worlds do, and the tank beneath the top slowly filled with rainwater and fallen leaves and the accumulated debris of time. But sometimes, late at night, when the park was closed and the lights were dimmed and the silence descended like a blessing over everything, something strange would happen. The security guards on their rounds would pause near the covered tank and feel something, a presence, a heaviness, a sense that they were not alone. They would look at the top, grey and weathered and sagging in the middle, and they would shiver despite the warmth of the night. Then they would shake their heads, blame it on imagination, and continue their rounds, but the feeling never quite went away. It lingered, hung in the air like mist over water, waited in the shadows like a memory that refused to be forgotten. And perhaps, in some way that science cannot measure and logic cannot explain, she was still there. Not her body, which had been cremated and scattered with great ceremony into an ocean she had not seen since childhood. Not her mind, which had finally found the rest that had been denied to it for 5 decades. But something, some echo, some imprint, some trace of all those years of watching and waiting and swimming endless circles in search of something that had never been there to find. Perhaps she was still there, in the water that had held her, in the glass that had separated her from the world, in the silence that filled the tank like a held breath. Perhaps she would always be there, waiting for the faces at the glass, waiting for the recognition that had come too late, waiting for someone to understand what it had meant to be her, to live her life, to be both the most watched creature on earth and the most profoundly alone. If this story stayed with you, if that silence meant something to you, subscribe to the channel. These stories are not about animals. They are about us. The faces at the glass never stopped coming. They come still, to parks around the world, the tanks that still hold whales and dolphins and sea lions and seals. They press close and stare in and ask their silent questions, the same questions that have been asked for generations. And the animals on the other side look back, with eyes that have seen millions of faces and will see millions more. Eyes that hold secrets we are only beginning to understand. Eyes that reflect our own faces back to us in ways that make us wonder, just for a moment, who is really watching whom. Some memories don't need to be defended. They only need to be remembered.